Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the 17th session of our study on Vedanta Syamantaka. So, in the last class, we completed the second chapter of this book. So, before we get into the third chapter, I thought we'll just have a brief recap of what all we have discussed till now. So, of course, as part of introduction, in the first 3 sessions, we discussed why Vedanta study is important for devotees also. So we discussed about that, and in the first chapter, we spoke about the different types of pramanas. Right? Yeah. So and there were totally 8 types of pramanas that we discussed in this work, and then of these 8, 3 are most prominent: Pratyaksha, Anuman, and Shabda. And to get the knowledge of the absolute truth, it is possible only through this Shabda Pramana, and Pratyaksha and Anuman basically support the Shabda Pramana that we discussed. The second chapter was long. I think we almost spent 9 sessions on that. So just a quick recap of what all we discussed in the second chapter. So second ray explains the nature of Lord Vishnu, the Supreme Lord of everything, Ishvara, Sarveshvara. He is endowed with eternal, unlimited, transcendental attributes that are intrinsic to his Swarupa, such as omniscience, omnipotence, and so on. His multifarious potencies are also inherent within him and act in various capacities. So we discussed about the concept of Vishesha. Considering all this, it's mentioned here as well. All these are non-different from the Supreme Lord, yet function as if different on account of Vishesha. And before that, we also saw the definition of the absolute truth, what Brahman is, and so on. Lord Vishnu, superior to all demigods, is the source of all of them and is the worshipful Lord of all of them. He is the supreme soul within all beings, and surrender unto him is the means of liberation. So we discussed how among the demigods, the Supreme Lord is the supreme by definition, Tamishwaranam, Paramamaheshwaram, and so on. And we also saw of the demigods, the topmost demigods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and what is their interrelationship and how they span out in terms of the universal administration. And we also saw how the potency that Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva have within this universe for the universal administration actually comes from the Supreme Lord, who is present as Super Soul within these personalities, and surrender unto him is the only means of liberation. We saw the various forms of the Lord, 200 form, 400 form, 800 form, all of which are eternal and spiritual. And we also saw that he is always accompanied by his eternal spiritual energies, Lakshmi Devi, who may also manifest herself in conformity with his form. And she is also all-pervading, omniscient, omnipotent, just like the Supreme Lord, but still categorized as his energy. Just as Krishna is the original form of all Vishnu Tattva manifestations, then Srimati Radharani is the original form of Lakshmi Tattva. So we finished our discussion on this particular point. Right. Okay. So today, from today onwards, we will be discussing about the nature of the individual soul, that is the Jiva. So there are 5 essential elements, essential tattvas to understand the absolute truth. There is Ishvara, Jiva, Prakriti, Kala, and Karma. So this is the whole gamut of Vedantic study. We have already discussed the tattva of Ishvara. So today we will be discussing Jiva tattva. Right. And this is one of the important aspects of self-realization, and there's always a confusion with respect to Jiva in different schools of thought, because the Supreme Lord is conscious and Jiva is also conscious. Okay, so when we are speaking about the energies of the Lord, Then we have the Supreme Lord and his three energies. There is intrinsic energy, internal energy or Antaranga Shakti. Then there is Tatastha Shakti or the marginal energy and Bahiranga Shakti. Of these three energies, the internal potency and the marginal potency are conscious. Okay, so internal potency we discussed in the Ishvara itself because they are non-different from each other. But the Tatastha Shakti is the same as the Lord, but at the same time there are differences also. So that concept will be discussed in this first section itself. That although Ishvara and the Jiva are conscious, they are all spiritual. Both of them are Satchit Ananda Vigraha, but still there is a difference. And with respect to material energy, of course, there is a difference because the material energy is Achit, it is not conscious, whereas the Ishvara is conscious. And although we say that there is a difference between the material energy and the Lord, but still in one sense they are actually the same because there is no difference between the energetic and the energy. So energetic is the Ishvara, is the Supreme Lord, and energy is the material energy or Tatastha Shakti or the internal potency of the Lord. So actually there is no difference between these three, but still there are certain characteristics which allow for differentiation amongst these energies also. So we have already discussed Ishvara and the internal potency in the previous chapter. In this chapter we will be discussing the marginal potency of the Lord, and in the next chapter Prakriti will be discussing the Bahiranga Shakti or the external potency of the Lord. Right. So the first point that Srila Radha Damodar Goswami makes here is that nature of individual soul is of atomic consciousness. Right. So there is consciousness, but then it's atomic. And most of the section that we are going to discuss, at least today and most probably tomorrow also, those who are familiar with Srila Prabhupada's work, it's not going to be new. So we're not discussing something new. We're discussing only that which we already know of, but there are certain references which Srila Radha Damodar Goswami gives, and all subtle misconceptions that one may have, all those will be ironed out as we go through today's and tomorrow's session. So he writes, now the individual soul, Jiva, shall be defined. The wise affirm that atomic consciousness is the characteristic of the individual soul, as stated by the Shruti. Eshonur Atma Chetasa Veditavyo Yasmin Prana Panchada Samviveshta. This is from Mundaka Upanishad. This is this atomic soul. So Anur Atma. So Srila Prabhupada also in his several of his purports he writes about Anu Chaitanya and Vibhu Chaitanya. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur also he writes about this. There is Anu and Vibhu. Although both are conscious, but then one is atomically conscious, another is supremely conscious. So this atomic soul, in which the fivefold life here has entered, should be understood by the intellect. Okay, so this is going to be our exercise. We are trying to understand the living entity, the soul, using several references from the Vedic scriptures and try to understand using our intellect. Then Balagra Shatabhagasya Shatadha Kalpitasya cha Bhago Jiva Savignyaya Sachanantyaya Kalpate. This is from Shvetashvatara Upanishad. The individual soul is meant for liberation and should be understood as having the size conceived as the 100th part of the tip of a hair, again divided by 100. So we are aware of this verse also, it comes in Bhagavad Gita itself. And actually what we are going to discuss here is there in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita itself, from I think 16th verse to 30th verse. Whatever is supposed or whatever we are meant to know about the living entity, about Jiva, is all explained there. Okay. So we'll not be getting into too much detail with all these references, because if we read Srila Prabhupada's works, this entire understanding of the Jiva and Ishvara is spread throughout his purports and his different books. So I'll be presenting only those references which clarify the understanding of what Srila Radha Damodar Goswami presents here, just to ensure that we are within the time scope. Otherwise, this can go on for a long time, for months, right? Okay. So this is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, text 17, purport. Srila Prabhupada writes, the individual particle of spirit soul is spiritual atom, smaller than the material atoms, and such atoms are innumerable. This very small spiritual spark is the basic principle of the material body, and the influence of such a spiritual spark is spread all over the body as the influence of the active principle of some medicine spreads throughout the body. This current of the spirit soul is felt all over the body as consciousness, and that is the proof of the presence of the soul. Any layman can understand that the material body minus consciousness is a dead body, and this consciousness cannot be revived in the body by any means of material administration. You see several arguments Srila Prabhupada put forth in the first few sentences itself. One is that the consciousness, that the spirit soul is a very small spiritual spark. Okay, and this spiritual spark spreads its influence all over the body, but only to that particular body, not to other bodies, just like a medicine spreads throughout the body. This is felt all over the body as consciousness. So we are conscious of the different limbs of our body, and therefore the presence of consciousness is the proof of the presence of soul. Right? Any layman can understand that the material body minus consciousness is a dead body, and this consciousness is spiritual in nature because it cannot be revived in the body by any means of material administration. Therefore, consciousness is not due to any amount of material combination but to the spirit soul. In the Mundaka Upanishad, the measurement of the atomic spirit soul is further explained, and Srila Prabhupada quotes the same verse. The soul is atomic in size and can be perceived by perfect intelligence. This atomic soul is floating in the 5 kinds of air: prana, apana, vyana, samana and udana. The soul is situated within the heart and spreads its influence all over the body of the embodied living entities. When the soul is purified from the contamination of the 5 kinds of material air, its spiritual influence is exhibited. These 5 kinds of air basically are like the in-between, the via medium between the living entity and the senses of the body. Okay, so and each of these prana, apana, vyana, samana, udana have different activities. So this is there in one of the purports of Bhagat. We will not be getting into details of this, but this is like a via medium. So how the soul interacts with the different senses of this body, it happens through this prana, and these different senses can be the working senses as well as the knowledge acquiring senses. So Karmendriya as well as Jnanendriya, they work because of these 5 different kinds of air. Actually there are 10 different kinds which are further defined, but primarily these are the 5 air. And whenever the senses in our body become weak, most probably the reason is because of imbalance in these vayus. Srila Prabhupada continues, the Hatha Yoga system is meant for controlling the 5 kinds of air, encircling the pure soul by different kinds of sitting postures, not for any material profit, but for liberation of the minute soul from the entanglement of the material atmosphere. So when one performs different types of sitting postures or asana, according to Patanjali Yoga system, there is asana also. That's one of the aspects of the Ashtanga Yoga system. So this is meant for regulating the 5 kinds of air. And because these air are actually in touch with the senses, by regulating this air, the senses are mechanically controlled. Okay, so there, why we are saying it's mechanically controlled? Because the mind is not being employed to control the senses, but the life air is being employed to control the senses. So therefore, it's mechanical in nature in that way. So when one performs asanas and all, the air within the body becomes regulated. It flows in certain ways through the nadis and all, because of which the senses are automatically withdrawn. Kurmo gnani va sarvashaha, like that. But the mind is not actively involved in this case, so therefore it's called as mechanical. So that is Hatha Yoga system. Srila Prabhupada continues. So the constitution of the atomic soul is admitted in all Vedic literatures, and it is also actually felt in the practical experience of any sane man. Only the insane man can think of this atomic soul as all-pervading Vishnu Tattva. Because Vishnu Tattva is all-pervading, whereas the living entity is pervading within the jurisdiction of his body alone. This is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, text 29. Ascharyavat pashyati kashchidenam, ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyah, ascharyavat chainam anyashrunoti, shrutvaapyenam vedanati chaiva kaschit. Some look on the soul as amazing, some describe his as amazing, and some hear of him as amazing, while others, even after hearing about him, cannot understand him at all. Srila Prabhupada writes, since Gita Upanishad is fully based on the principles of the Upanishads, it is not surprising to find this parallel passage in the Katha Upanishad. Shinvanyapi bahubir yona labhyaha, shinvanto bi bahavo yamna vidyuhu, ascharya bhakta kushalosya labdha, Ascharya Jnata Kushalanushishtah. The fact that the atomic soul is within the body of a gigantic animal, in the body of a gigantic banyan tree, and also in the microbic germs, millions and billions of which occupy only an inch of space, is certainly very amazing. So, the reason why I put this reference is that although the living entity is very, very small, it's Balagrashata Bhagasya, but still it can actually animate a very gigantic animal or a banyan tree which can be spread over very large area or kilometers also, and it is also present inside the microbic germs. So by the influence of the Lord, by the potency of the Lord, a minute living entity has the potency to exhibit or to animate or to be conscious of huge bodies as well as the same time very minute bodies as well. Men with a poor fund of knowledge and men who are not austere cannot understand the wonders of the individual atomic spark of spirit, even though it is explained by the greatest authority of knowledge, who imparted lessons even to Brahma, the first living being in the universe. Owing to a gross material conception of things, most men in this age cannot imagine how such a small particle can become both so great and so small. So men look at the soul proper as wonderful either by constitution or by description. Illusioned by the material energy, people are so engrossed in subject matters for sense gratification that they have very little time to understand the question of self-understanding, even though it is a fact that without the self-understanding, all activities result in ultimate defeat in the struggle for existence. Perhaps they have no idea that one must think of the soul and thus make a solution to the material miseries. Some people who are inclined to hear about the soul may be attending lectures in good association, but sometimes owing to ignorance they are misguided by acceptance of the super soul and the atomic soul as one without distinction of magnitude. It is very difficult to find a man who perfectly understands the position of the super soul, the atomic soul, their respective functions and relationships, and all other major and minor details. And it is still more difficult to find a man who has actually derived full benefit from knowledge of the soul and who is able to describe the position of the soul in different aspects. But if somehow or other one is able to understand the subject matter of the soul, then one's life is successful. So our study is meant for this purpose. This is Srila Prabhupada's lecture on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 2, Text 5, which he gave in Los Angeles in 1968. He says, living entities, we are simultaneously one and different from God. One in this sense, that all the qualities that God has, the same qualities the living entity has. But the difference is God has all the qualities in fullness, and so far we are concerned, we have got all the godly qualities in minute. That is the difference, Anu and Vibhu. Vibhu means unlimited and Anu means limited. So we have got opulence, fame, beauty, strength, influence, knowledge, all good qualities that God has. But God has got in full, we have got in minute quantity. So all, Aishwarya, Samagrasa, Virasa, Shashari, everything we have, but in a very minute quantity, whereas the Lord has everything in full. So therefore is called Bhagavan. Right? Then the author continues. Nityo Nityanam Chetanash Chetananam Eko Bahunam Yo Vidadhati Kaman. There is one eternal being among many eternal beings, one sentient being among many sentient beings, the one who brings about their desirable objects. So this is again an argument which he presents, a quote which he presents to prove that there are several living entities who are actually have atomic consciousness, but there is one who is supremely conscious and whose consciousness pervades the entire creation, both the material creation as well as the spiritual creation. So this verse actually has many different connotations. One is that Nityo Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam. So Nityanam is Bahuvachan. Bahuvachan means it's plural. So plural, wherever plural is mentioned, if all the living entities are homogeneous, one single entity, then there is no point of mentioning them as plural. So therefore each of the living entities is actually individual, and each individual has his atomic consciousness. But among the Chetanas, among all these living entities who are conscious, there is one who is actually supremely conscious. And among all the eternals, there is one who is supremely eternal. So there are three things which is actually mentioned within the verse itself. One is that there are so many living entities who are eternal, there are so many living entities who are conscious. Each of these living entities are different because Bahuvachan, because this thing, multiplicity, plurality is being mentioned. Each of the living entities is an individual. At the same time, amongst all these living entities, one living entity is superior. So Ishvara is mentioned, Jiva is there, at the same time there is distinction or individuality amongst Jiva also. And individuality is there between Ishvara and Jiva as well. So all these different aspects, connotations are there right in this verse itself. Correct? So Srila Prabhupada, he explains this in a lecture that he gave in Pittsburgh in 1972. He says, this is also confirmed in the Upanishads, Vedas, Nitya Nityanam, Chetanas Chetananam, Eko Bahunam, Yo Vidadhati Kaman. The God is also eternal and we are also eternal. We are part and parcels of God. Just like gold and fragments of gold, both of them are gold. Although I am fragment, a particle of gold or the spirit, still I am spirit. So we get this information that both God and we, living entities, we are eternal. Nitya Nityanam. Nitya means eternal. So two words are there. One is singular number, Nitya, eternal, and other is plural number, Nityanam. So we are plural number, eternals. We do not know what is the numerical strength of the living entities. They are described as asankhya, which basically suggests the fact that there is difference, there are individuality amongst this plurality also. Asankhya means without any counting capacity, millions and trillions. Then what is the difference between this singular number and the plural number? The plural number is dependent on the singular number. Eko bahunam vidadhati kaman. The singular number eternal is giving all the necessities of life to the plural number we, living entities. That's a fact we can examine by our intelligence. So this is not only true to this material realm, this is true in the spiritual realm also. So when one gets liberated, of course we will see further also that there are several ideas which the Mayavadis mentioned which will be refuted. But they say that once we become liberated, then actually we become totally independent. But that is not the case. Even after going to the spiritual realm, still there is one eternal who is actually maintaining all the other eternals. Tam pithagam yeto yajanti vipras tesham shanti shashvati netaresham. It's from Gopal Tapani Upanishad. The wives who worship the Supreme Lord, who is situated in the highest abode, attain everlasting peace and not others. Therefore, this refutes the theory that Brahman, when perplexed, becomes a single individual soul, and everything other than Brahman, the living entities, Prakriti, the metal elements, and God, are imagined to exist on account of ignorance, avidya, of Brahman, like a dreamer and the things dreamed about, such as chariots, for according to the Shruti, the multiple individual souls are eternal and conscious. So we have been discussing this theory which is propagated by Advaitavadis, and there will be refutations going forward also. Srila Prabhupada gave a lecture on Bhagavad Gita chapter 4 text 5 in Montreal in 1968. So he writes, actually we are eternal, both God and the living entities, they are qualitatively one, eternal. Satchidananda Vigraha, Sat means eternity, Chit means full of knowledge, and Ananda means full of joy. These are the qualifications of God and living entity. Therefore, we are hankering after pleasure. All people are working hard day and night for pleasure, because by constitution, he is pleasureful, joyful. As soon as there is a little hindrance to the process of his joyfulness, he becomes sorry. This is my nature, Satchidananda Vigraha. But God and the living entity, both being Satchidananda Vigraha, Vigraha means form, individuality. So God has form and you have got also form. I have got also form. Everyone has got form. Nitya Nityanam, Chetanas Chetananam. He is the supreme individual personality and we are subordinate personalities. That is the difference. Otherwise, in quality, God, you and me are all the same. That Krishna says. So this is in furthering our argument that when we speak about Nitya Nityanam, Chetanas Chetananam, we are not only talking about Chetana, but we are also talking about Vigraha. So they are not only supremely conscious, it's not that only they are conscious and after liberation they become merged into one single consciousness. They have individuality also, they have forms. So each and every living entity is Satchid Ananda Vigraha. And Krishna is Ishvara Parama Krishna Sachidananda Vigraha. So the Supreme Lord is also Sachidananda Vigraha. And because the living entities are expansions of the Supreme Lord, they are also Sachidananda Vigraha. But their Satchit and Ananda is actually dependent on the Supreme Lord. We will see there are references that are coming for that part. Consciousness of the soul is eternal. That's the next argument that he presents, the next topic that he presents. That which means that the consciousness is not actually subject to destruction. So one may say that the soul, you may call the soul or whatever you try to call that as eternal, but the consciousness arises because of material combination. But that is not so. The consciousness is also eternal quality of the individual soul. The individual soul has eternal consciousness as a quality as stated in the Shruti. Avinashi va ayam atma anuchitti dharma. O Maitreyi, the individual soul is imperishable and has indestructible attributes. Nahi vigyatir vigyatir viparilopo vidyate. Okay, this one also by Vedanta Upanishad. The consciousness of the sentient being is never destroyed. The individual soul is eternal and has the quality of consciousness which is also eternal. Consciousness cannot be destroyed, it can be covered though. So there are amongst the 6 philosophers, or rather I should say among the 5 philosophers, there are those who accept the eternality of the soul, but then they say that the consciousness arises due to material combinations. Because of the combination of the material ego, then the consciousness of the living entity arises, which makes him relate to this material world. So to defeat that particular aspect of this other darshanas, this argument is being made. So he continues and he writes, although atomic, the individual soul pervades all limbs of the body by the quality of consciousness as stated in the Brahma Sutra, Vedanta Sutra. Gunad Valukavat, or because the quality of consciousness pervades the whole body just like light. It is also said by the Supreme Lord in Bhagavad Gita, Yatha prakashayatyekah kritsnam lokam imam ravihi kshetram kshetri tatha kritsnam prakashayati bharata. Just as a single sun illuminates this whole world, a single soul illuminates the whole body, O descendant of Bharat. So it is a soul which has the quality or characteristics of consciousness. Consciousness does not arise because of material combinations. Now this is a reference from Vedanta Sutra. This is 2.3.26. Here he quotes 2.3.24, but this actually furthers our understanding. So this sutra is Prathak Upadeshat. Knowledge in the Jiva is eternal because of teachings in the scriptures, other than the statement that the Atma is a seer. Okay, so commentary goes like this. Knowledge as a quality of the Jiva is eternal. Now, it's mentioned knowledge here, but I think we discussed it before also that Chit can be translated both as knowledge as well as consciousness. So, when we speak of Sat, Chit and Ananda, then Sat means the eternal aspect of the living entity. Chit is knowledge, full of knowledge, Prabhupada writes when referring to Ishvara, and Ananda is to seek pleasure or blissfulness. So, Chit has two connotations, two aspects. One is knowledge and another is consciousness. And the reason for that is because knowledge, one who is conscious, he has awareness. And awareness basically means that he has knowledge of other things which is apart from him. He has knowledge of himself as well as he has knowledge of others also. He is conscious of himself, okay, and he is also getting knowledge of other things which is surrounding him. So that is why it is said, this example, this says, just as a single soul illuminates the whole world. Sorry, just as a single sun illuminates this whole world. A single soul illuminates the whole body. So in Vedantic circle, this particular reference is actually very prominent, and it is made that the sun, by giving out light, it actually illuminates itself. At the same time, it also illuminates everything else. So it has these two properties. So only when the sun illuminates itself, then one will be able to experience the sun. At the same time, the sun, because it's giving out rays, therefore one will also be able to experience other things around. So the soul also is like that. The soul is luminous in the sense that it reveals itself. At the same time, it is also aware. Yeah, so we had a connection problem for 5 minutes. So we'll continue. Right, so we were discussing that just as a single sun illuminates this whole world, a single soul illuminates the whole body. And we also discussed, like only 5 minutes back, that Chit actually can refer to both knowledge as well as consciousness. So we will read this commentary on Vedanta Sutra, Prithak Upadeshat. So it is mentioned, knowledge as a quality of the Jiva is eternal. Why? Because other than the statement, Prithak, that the Jiva is a seer, there are teachings of the Jiva having eternal knowledge. In Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 4.5.14, Avinashi va areyam atmanuchitti dharma, the same verse which Srila Radha Damodar Goswami quotes. So it's written, the Jiva is indestructible and has indestructible qualities. Knowledge does not arise in the Jiva by contact with the mind, because contact cannot take place between two items having no parts. This knowledge becomes covered by turning away from the Lord, and it manifests by turning towards the Lord, the destruction of aversion to the Lord. Okay, we'll discuss that. Smriti, Vishnu Dharma Purana says, Yathana kriyate josna mala prakshalanaan manehe dosha prahanan nagyanam atmana kriyate tatha. Just as by washing away dirt, light is not created in a jewel, so by destroying faults, knowledge is not created in the Jiva. Yathodapana khananat kriyatena jalantaram sad eva niyate vyaktim asata sambhava kutaha. Just as water is not created by digging a well, an existing thing simply becomes manifest. How can something not existing appear? Tatha heya guna dhvamsad avarodhadayo gunaha prakashyante na janyante nitya evatmano hite. Similarly, by destruction of bad qualities, the obscured qualities which are eternal in the Atma manifest. They are not created. So this particular sutra is specifically speaking about knowledge. So there are multiple connotations to it. One is our current context of discussion, which is consciousness. Consciousness does not arrive in the Jiva because of some material combination. It's not that the Jiva was not conscious at one point and then he attains consciousness at a certain point of time because of material combinations. That is not the case. And another is the Jiva's eternal constitutional position as having full knowledge of the Supreme Lord is also not created in due course of time. So it's not that, there are several references to this also. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, Jivera Swarupohe Krishna Nityadas. So it is not something which is to be acquired from outside. Actually, the Swarupa of the Jiva itself is to be eternal servant of the Lord. Similarly, knowledge of the Jiva with respect to Ishvara, with respect to Prakriti, and with respect to himself is also eternal, is also inherent within the Jiva itself. It does not manifest, or it's not something which is to be gained from outside. So the illumination part, or the Jiva being aware of himself and of the actual reality of the absolute truth, is actually eternal. But now, in our present stage, that knowledge is not manifest because we are covered by the modes of material nature. So the Jiva is always illuminous, is always Sat, Chit and Ananda. It's not that these qualities have to be acquired by performance of spiritual practices and bhakti. It's already there within the living entity, but the whole process of devotional service, of performing the spiritual practices, of undergoing different rules and regulations is only to remove the coverings of the modes of material nature, remove the contamination of material nature which is covering the eternal nature of the spirit soul. Once that is covered, then the living entity is automatically manifest, or he automatically illuminates all his different qualities. It is like a light source being covered with an opaque material. Okay, so it's not that the light is switched off and then we're switching on the light. It's just that we're removing the opaque material which is covering the light, and once we remove that material, then the light is self-luminous. Correct? It illuminates itself and also it illuminates everything around. So the Jiva, by taking the process of devotional service, he does two things. One, he understands himself, that's self-realization. And another is he understands everything about the Lord and his relationship with himself as well as with other living entities. And because the Supreme Lord is the Jiva is actually dependent on the Supreme Lord, one who performs Krishna consciousness, one who takes the devotional service, one who situates himself in Krishna consciousness, he understands everything. his eternal position. He realizes himself as Jiva, and he also realizes that he is an eternal servant of the Lord and he has to perform devotional service. Everything, all this realization is together. It comes together when one performs devotional service to the Lord. So when one is situated in Krishna consciousness, all these things are automatically revealed. So that is why Srila Prabhupada also writes in several places that to understand or to realize the soul, we don't have to perform any additional activities. The path of devotional service itself is enough to reveal oneself as well as the Lord and one's relationship with Him. Also the Lord's relationship with everybody else. So knowledge is automatically there. It's there and it will be revealed. So it's revelation. It's not something which is to be installed on the soul. It actually reveals Himself. So knowledge is an inherent quality of the Jiva. Similarly, consciousness is also inherent quality. So it might seem that or rather, it is seen in this material world that the consciousness of different species of life are different. The trees are conscious on a very, very low level. The animals are conscious to some extent, but the human beings have more elevated consciousness, because of which they will be able to understand all these different topics. So the manifestation of consciousness is actually dependent on the modes of material nature, but that does not mean that this consciousness of the living entity, the pure spirit soul, is actually demolished or it is being reduced. There is no reduction, there is no demolition, there is no hampering of the consciousness, or rather there is hampering in the sense that it is covered. So there is coverage, this covering is there because of the modes of material nature, but actually each and every living entity is fully conscious of its position. So how the living entity gets covered, we will see in the subsequent chapter, in the 4th chapter. But this point of time, what we have to understand is that the consciousness does not arise within the spirit soul out of some combination or at certain point of time. Just as the living entity is eternal, his consciousness and his knowledge is also eternal. It is not separable from him. Right? That's the point. Srila Prabhupada writes in Bhagavad Gita chapter 13 text 34 purport, he says, when the soul is present in the body, there is consciousness all over the body, and as soon as the soul has passed from the body, there is no more consciousness. This can be easily understood by any intelligent man. Therefore, consciousness is not a product of the combinations of matter. It is a symptom of the living entity. The consciousness of the living entity, although qualitatively one with the supreme consciousness, is not supreme because the consciousness of one particular body does not share that of another body. But the super soul, which is situated in all bodies as the friend of the individual soul, is conscious of all bodies. That is the difference between supreme consciousness and individual consciousness. And again, in a lecture, Srila Prabhupada speaks, this is in 1966, early days. Consciousness is eternal. Consciousness is eternal. And consciousness is the symptom of the soul. Soul is eternal. When the soul takes shelter in the matter, then the matter develops. Not that the combination of matter you can produce soul. That is not possible. If that would have been possible, then there are many great scientists and many scientific laboratories, especially in our Western countries, in Europe and America, but nobody could produce a single living being in the laboratory, scientific laboratory. That is not possible. Okay, so this is very clear. This is what we discussed. And Srila Radha Goswami, he further gives argument that the soul is individually conscious even when the material ego is dissolved, which basically proves our discussion now. So he writes, the I should be understood as the very individual soul, since there is awareness of the I during the stage of deep sleep, when the material ego, ahankara, has dissolved. The Shruti also declares, Sukham ayam asvapsam na kinchit avedisham. I slept happily and was not aware of anything. So this is actually, there are several references to this. So what he's saying is there are 4 stages of consciousness. Okay, one is Jagrita, when the living entity is aware of the outside world, the material world. Then there is Nidra, when one is sleeping, where the external senses are not active, but the mind is active. So this is called as dream state, right, where Swapna is there. Swapna means dream. So where there is a dream state, there is an awareness there also. The third state is called Shushupti. So Shushupti is the deep sleep state where the living entity is not aware, the external senses are not working, and at the same time the mind is also not active. So when one sleeps deep, When there's a deep sleep, then it is mentioned in the Shastra that it's a dissolving of the material ego itself. So the material nature actually dissolves at that point of time when there's a deep sleep. And then Turiya is the stage when the living entity realizes his transcendental position, and that's the liberated platform where he realizes that he is the eternal part and parcel of the Lord and he has to serve the Lord. So there are 4 stages of consciousness. So this reference is from Tattva Sandarbha, this text 54, where Sri Jiva Goswami explains this particular point, and he quotes this verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 3, Text 39. We'll read the translation. So he says, the spirit soul is born in many different species of life within the material world. Some species are born from eggs, others from embryos, others from the seeds of plants and trees, and others from perspiration. But in all species of life, the prana or vital air remains unchanging and follows the spirit soul from one body to another. Similarly, the spirit soul is eternally the same despite its material condition. We have practical experience of this. Right? This is the point. The spirit soul is eternally the same despite its material condition. And we have practical experience of this. When we are absorbed in deep sleep without dreaming, the material senses become inactive. And even the mind and false ego are merged into a dormant condition. But although the senses, mind and false ego are inactive, one remembers upon waking that he, the soul, was peacefully sleeping. So this is via experience. So this everybody has experienced. This is Gopiparananda Prabhu's commentary on this particular text of Tattva Sandarbha. He writes, the Vedic literature presents the best science of psychology. For example, the verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, which we read now, presented in this Anuched, provides an enlightened model of the state of affairs of a conscious soul within the material coverings. The first half of the verse says that the soul remains unchanging while passing from one body to another. And because this fact cannot be established empirically, the verse then uses the varieties of experience the soul undergoes within a single body as an analogy to help us understand the changeless nature of the soul. During each typical day of its embodied life, a living being passes in and out of 3 basic psychological states: external wakefulness, that is Jagrata, dreaming, Swapna, and dreamless deep sleep, this is Shushupti. Physical psychology has identified these 3 states as electroencephalography, but gives no clue about the basis of these different states. According to Vedic revelation, the jiva in material existence is covered first by a subtle body composed of ego, intelligence and mind, and then by the outward tangible body, subtle body and gross body. In wakefulness, Jagrana, a person's senses are active in contact with the outside world. So that is one state. Within, his senses are also connected to the awake mind, which selectively pays attention to varieties of sensory input. Right? We have discussed this also in the first chapter. Through further connections with the intelligence and ego, this input reaches the jiva, the actual seat of consciousness in this complex, subtle mechanism. When a person is in the second state of sleep, nidra, his external senses are inactive, but the mind, which though lacking input from the physical world is still active, creates dreams. And although there is no physical input from the senses, the dreams actually are created from the impressions which are stored within the mind. Vritti, so many samskaras are there. So impressions that we inculcate within our mind by coming in contact during the Jagrata state, those impressions are actually stored. And this is what is revealed. And there are stories which are created around that by the mind using those impressions. Right? In the third state, that of deeper sleep, Shushupti, the 3 components of the subtle body are also become dormant. Shruti testifies that the soul is present and conscious in deep sleep. Although he is not in touch with any external sensations, concrete memories, external sensations through the senses, concrete memories in the mind or dreams, he continues to witness his own existence. It is said that he perceives a kind of pleasure in deep sleep, a mild, temporary version of Brahmananda, the bliss known after liberation from material bondage. Because he still has desires for material enjoyment, the soul must leave this state and wake up again. But by this daily bathing in his natural happiness, he receives the rest he needs to endure his ongoing material life. So then he quotes Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Prajnanenatmana samparishvakto na bahyam kinchana veda nantaram. Embraced by the omniscient super soul, he has no knowledge of anything external or internal. Even while thus unaware of anything else, the soul in deep sleep vaguely and unconsciously perceives the presence of himself and his constant companion in the heart, the super soul. Thus, after waking, he sometimes says, I slept so comfortably that I wasn't aware of anything, although he was aware that he slept so nicely. In other words, he remembers his own sustained existence through the period of deep sleep. The true ego of the eternal soul always underlies his false ego of material identification, ahankara, uncovering itself momentarily in Shushupti. It continues after final liberation as the soul's self-awareness of being a servant of the Supreme Person. So these states are also referred to in Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 13, Text 27, and in Canto 11, 25 and 20. So you can go ahead and read that. So in the deep sleep, although there is no interaction, the point that is being made here is that although in deep sleep there is no external interaction with the senses are not interacting with their sense objects, the mind is not actively involved in creating stories around the impressions that it already has, and the false ego is literally dissolved because all the subtle body as well as the gross body is not manifest actively at that point. Still, there is an awareness which is being reflected by the living entity when he wakes up from a deep sleep, and then he realizes, he understands that he has slept so nicely. So although his senses were not active, his gross body was not active, subtle body was not active, but still there is an awareness that he has slept so nicely, he has slept so deep that he is feeling refreshed and rested. So this is an example to point out that the soul, the consciousness of the soul or the awareness of the soul actually does not arise from either gross material elements or subtle material elements, but actually it arises, it is inherent within the soul itself. So that's the point that we are trying to prove here. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So the next section is the soul does not undergo material transformation. Okay, so moreover, the individual soul is different from the gross and subtle body and is devoid of the 6 existential transformations. So we are talking about different characteristics of the soul. So first we discussed that the soul is Anu, the Supreme Lord is Vibhu, correct? And after that we discussed that, just a quick recap so that we are in proper context of what we are actually doing here. We discussed that, and then after this we saw that the living entities are also individual, and there is one supreme entity, living entity, who actually fulfills all their desires, and this is applicable both on the liberated state as well as in the material state. Then we also saw that the consciousness of the soul is not subject to destruction, it does not arise at any point of time, it's always inherent to the living entity. So for that we saw several references, and in continuation to that same point, it is also mentioned that the soul is individually conscious even when the material ego is dissolved. Next is the soul does not undergo material transformation. So till this point it is understood that there are 2 things we are talking about. There is this material nature and then this is living entity. Okay, so till this point we have discussed that the living entity's consciousness is not subject to transformation. And furthermore, that point, same point, is that when the living entity gets entangled within this material world, it's not that the soul itself gets transformed. It's only the covering. The soul does not undergo the 6 existential transformations. So this verse speaks about that. Natma vapu parthivam indriyani deva hyasur vayu jalam hutashah manonna matram dishana cha sattvam ahankriti kham shitir artha samyam. The individual soul is not this body made of earth, nor the senses and their controlling deities, nor the vital air, breath, water or fire, nor the mind, food, intelligence, thought, material ego, ether, earth, sense objects, nor material nature. The individual soul has neither been born nor will die, nor does it grow or decay. The individual soul is actually the observer of the various phases of all changeable things. The soul is pure consciousness, eternally imperishable in all circumstances. The various existential states are imagined just as the single vital air is imagined as manifold by the influence of different sense organs. So there are 6 states of body transformations, right? There is birth, then there is growth, then there is sustenance, then there is production of byproducts, then dwindling, and finally death. So each and every living entity, it goes through the 6 transformation phases, but these 6 transformations do not have any effect on the living entity. Although the consciousness that is manifested at each of these states is actually different. When the baby is born, the consciousness is different, correct? He is aware of only certain things. Then as he grows, then his consciousness changes. Then when he's grown up, he sustains for some time, the consciousness is a certain level. Then there's byproducts. Then when the body dwindles, then also the senses, the consciousness is kind of withdrawn from the senses. And then when person dies, the body is left and the soul moves away. But in each of the 6 stages, the soul actually is not impacted at all. The soul itself does not undergo any transformation. It is only the bodily transformations that undergo. And because the soul identifies with the body, his consciousness is different at different stages of the 6 transformation. So when the 6 transformations are mentioned, it does not mean that the soul actually has a different or like a varying level of consciousness at each space. The consciousness is eternal. It is the same. It is just that because of the covering of the consciousness is manifested in different levels. The consciousness itself, the inherent nature of the soul itself does not change. It's just the manifestation in connection with the mental energy that consciousness is manifested differently within a body and also in between different species of life. Right, so that's the point. I'll just read this purport. Srila Prabhupada's disciples write this purport in Canto 11, Chapter 3, Text 38. They say, the argument may be raised that although the spirit soul is pure consciousness, upalabdhi matram, it is our practical experience that consciousness is constantly transformed. Correct? We discussed that. If I am thinking of a blue object such as the sky, then my previous thought of a yellow object such as a flower is destroyed. Because we are aware only of the blueness of the sky at this point. Whereas we have forgotten or we are not conscious of the yellow object of the flower. Similarly, if I become aware that I am hungry, then my consciousness of the blue sky is destroyed. I hope you are able to understand. So because at certain level, the consciousness keeps changing. Right? We are aware of certain thing, but then we are not aware of other things also. So which basically suggests that the consciousness is changing. In this way, consciousness is constantly being transformed. Srila Sridhar Swami has replied that consciousness itself is eternal, but in contact with the material senses, it may be manifest in various ways. The example of the life air is very appropriate. Prana or the life air is one, but in contact with the different senses, it is manifest as the power to see, the power to hear, and so on. Similarly, consciousness being spiritual is ultimately one, but when in contact with the various senses, it may be perceived in terms of particular sensory functions. But the state of consciousness is an eternal fact that cannot be changed, although it may be temporarily covered by Maya. Right? So this is a reference in Chandogya Upanishad 5.1.15. It is mentioned the different senses such as voice, sense of sight, sense of hearing and the mind are all known as the life force. But the actual life force is different from all these senses which are dependent upon it. So in the Upanishads, the senses such as voice, the sense of sight, the sense of hearing and the mind are referred to as prana at different sections of the Upanishads. So this particular verse, it clarifies that although they all are known as life force, but the actual life force, the actual prana is different from all these senses which are dependent upon it. They are named after the life force, although it is actually different from them. So similarly, the consciousness which is manifested at different states of existence and in the different senses also although it may seem to perform different things, but the consciousness is one single entity. It's eternal, which is the symptom of the soul, and it does not undergo any transformation. So that is what we have to understand. Okay, so yeah, so we don't have time now. So this, from this section onwards, we'll continue tomorrow. The soul is part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and we'll also see tomorrow will be an interesting session, because we'll be seeing whether the soul is a doer or not. We talked about consciousness today, but whether the soul himself is the doer or it's the material nature which is the doer. Correct? In Prakriti Kriyamanani Gune Karmani Sarvasha Ahankara Vimudatma Kartahamiti Manyate. The living entity under the material modes of nature thinks himself as the doer, but whereas the activities are being carried out by the modes of material nature. So does that mean that the living entity does not have any volition, it does not have any will or desire to do things? Is he the enjoyer or not? Is he the doer or not? Or are these things being carried out by the material nature only? So that discussion also will take place tomorrow. So we'll end here. If you have any questions, you can take one.
One question about the soul is full of knowledge. Knowledge is revealed. Soul possesses knowledge. Now we understand, in which way you understand this? Is it knowledge about spiritual matter, which knowledge of the relation to God, knowledge of the Rupa, and everything? Or how does this relate to the material knowledge? Can you say that we know also everything material, but also it's revealed to us? Or material knowledge is considered avidya? You know what I mean? Can you say that soul knows, has a knowledge, so therefore revealed? So do I have knowledge of material principles? Do I know how computer works? Do I know? You know what I mean? That soul has also material knowledge, but then that's the spiritual knowledge. Or is it material knowledge for knowledge for
I'm not able to properly. Can you please repeat that? Yeah, I got the gist of the question, but not the details. So as I understand, the question is that when we speak that the soul has knowledge inherent to that, what are we speaking about? Is it the spiritual knowledge, and does the soul is always aware of his swarupa in relation to the Lord? And how do we understand with respect to material knowledge? When we say the soul is full of knowledge, does he have material knowledge also about everything that is material? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Kind of. Okay. So, when we speak of knowledge of the living entity, then we are speaking about the spiritual knowledge. So the living entity is actually aware when we are speaking about the pure living entity, not contaminated by the modes of material nature. The living entity has its inherent swarupa. The living entity has the knowledge inherent within it to understand what his swarupa is, what his relationship with the Lord is, and how the whole spiritual realm works. And with respect to his swarupa and his relationship with the Lord, the living entity has all knowledge about that. Okay, but then he is not supremely knowledgeable also as Ishvara, as Krishna, he is not supremely knowledgeable. But with respect to himself and his relationship with the Lord and whatever is required for his service to the Lord, in the spiritual realm, the living entity has full knowledge. That knowledge is not manifested within this material realm because it's covered by the modes of material nature, starting with false ego. And whether the living entity has knowledge of the material realm, the tattva or the essence of the material knowledge may be aware to the living entity, but this whole material realm is manifested of the modes of material nature. So there are different varieties, and we also see, in different yugas, in different days of Brahma, different times, there are different varieties which are manifest within this material world. In Satyuga, the way life was led was different. In Treta, it was different. In Dwapar, it was different. In Kali, it's different. So there's always different types of varieties of things which are manifested by the material energy, and there are knowledge to be gained about these material energies also. So each and every aspect of the material energy, the living entity does not have to know. It's not required. In essence, only this much the living entity may know, that there is Bahiranga Shakti of the Lord, and that it is required to bewilder the living entities. But each and every different aspects, the living entity may not have eternal knowledge about how a laptop works or how a mobile works like that, because these are all different transformations of the modes of material nature. So essentially, the essential knowledge will be there, but not with respect to the different varieties which are created by the modes of material nature, which is actually not required. So this is my understanding. Anything else?
Short
Yes, Guru.
That point was very interesting. You spoke about the Aversion of spiritual Jnana,
Yes, Guru.
Chaitanya Jnana. It's a very good point to repeat the idea of the Maya. It's just that one point.
Yes.
To give a
Okay, so we'll stop here. Shri Radha Damodar Goswami ki, Jai. Srila Prabhupada ki, Jai.